Professor Lisa Sedaris, who is calling in from, I believe, California. Lisa is Professor of Environmental Studies at University of California, Santa Barbara, and she'll be talking to us about de-extinction and the quest for victory over death. Thanks so much for being here, Lisa, after your Thanksgiving holiday, and I will hand it over to you. Cool.
Well, first of all, thank you, everyone who organized this conference. I think there's probably a lot of connections between what I'm going to say and the talk that came before. I'm not a theologian, however, so one of the things I'm very interested in is the way that scientists sometimes turn to religious language to talk about their work, especially in very high-tech kinds of situations. So perhaps some of you who are better trained in theology and biblical exegesis will have some thoughts about this that have been, to me, kind of genuinely perplexing, why scientists do this, often in very high stakes kinds of situations. So my topic is about de-extinction. The prospect of reviving extinct species by means of various cutting-edge genetic techniques elicits awe from scientists and the public alike. Even de-extinction's detractors are often swept up in the excitement of a technology that purports to bring species back from the dead. And in particular, it's common to hear de-extinction promoted in overtly religious language, even or especially by scientists who otherwise reject the authority of religion and even in some cases despise it. De-extinction is saturated with the language of religion and the supernatural, frequently cast in terms of resurrection, reincarnation, revivalism, zombie zoology. These resurrection biologists position themselves as scientist saviors, commanding otherworldly forces. So in what follows, I want to explore the religious language of de-extinction, focusing on a key evangelizer of this technology, Australian paleontologist Michael Archer. In fact, most of my work recently has been about in the Australian context, because that's where a lot of this work is going on. Archer is a kind of de-extinction carnival barker, a media-savvy science communicator and self-styled species revivalist. No fan of Christianity, his promotion of de-extinction to broader audiences nevertheless involves a strange strategic turn to biblical sources, not just religious, but biblical in particular. So how does de-extinction work and why does it generate so much excitement? I'm just going to focus, there are a lot of different techniques. I'm just going to focus very briefly on the one that's considered to be one of the more promising paths to de-extinction. So DNA is extremely fragile, right? It begins decomposing as soon as an organism dies, and in many extinct species, it's unavailable, contaminated, or significantly degraded. For recently extinct species, clones can be created from cells collected from the last living organisms before a species went extinct. Here, the cells are implanted into an enucleated, that is, nucleus removed egg cell of a living relative. The resulting zygote is then gestated, and if all goes well, at least from the scientist's perspective, birthed by a surrogate species. So when intact cells are not available, which is generally the case with extinct species, hybrid methods that employ cloning, that is somatic cell nuclear transfer, alongside genomic editing techniques like CRISPR, strive to make up for the gaps in the DNA. The goal is to reconstruct the full genome of an extinct species using gene sequencing technologies that splice the incomplete DNA of the extinct organism with that of a related species. So, for example, elephants for woolly mammoths. A zygote is then formed, which is gestated and birthed by an extant surrogate. And in the case of mammoths, for example, the result would be a kind of cold-tolerant creature that outwardly resembles a mammoth, but is genetically similar to an Asian elephant. The reasons for wanting to create a cold-tolerant elephant is perhaps something we can talk more about in the Q&A, if you're not familiar with that. So de-extinction produces a proxy rather than an exact replica. In cases where SCNT, somatic cell nuclear transfer, is combined with gene editing, the resulting organism will be a kind of hybrid creature. A cloned mammoth would be neither an elephant nor a mammoth, but something like a mammophant or an Ellie-moth, whatever you want to call it. It's a fairy tale creature, a novelty. Even if de-extinction techniques are perfected to the point of manufacturing an authentic copy of an extinct counterpart, it's illogical to claim that a species has ceased to be extinct when an individual has been brought back. Species are not singular, individual, or static things. They're relational entities. In fact, that's why we lament their loss, I would argue. They're living repositories with long evolutionary histories shaped by complex interrelationships with other creatures and their natural environments. A de-extincted organism is more like a still image from a film than the film itself. Michael Archer's interest in de-extinction has focused specifically on iconic Australian organisms, the thylacine and the gastric brooding frog. I'm only going to talk about the latter and not the former, although there's a lot of really interesting things to say about the former, and some of my the larger version of this paper, it gets into quite a bit about the thylacine as well. So Archer is remarkably deft at working the media to ignite public excitement, even to the point of spreading misleading claims for the power of de-extinction technology. At the same time, he's the recipient of numerous awards and commendations for his public promotion of science. He's been honored with a Skeptic of the Year award for his passionate opposition to so-called creation science, and his warnings against what he calls the dangers to a nation's, that's your nation's, intellectual health being posed by fundamentalist dogma. So I'll return to these features of Archer's biography shortly, as they form a very interesting contrast with his turn to biblical sources to defend de-extinction. So the gastric brooding frog. This is from the area around Queensland, I believe, this frog before it went extinct. This frog possessed an uncanny ability to convert its stomach into a womb of sorts, ultimately giving birth through its mouth. Understanding the mechanisms that enabled it to shut off its gastric secretions and temporarily convert one organ into another, pretty amazing thing, could engender all kinds of medical breakthroughs, as Michael Archer and others have argued on the TED Talk circuit. Having established the frog's exciting medical potential, Archer's well-rehearsed account of the urgency, as he sees it, of its resurrection typically lands on another motivation. He says, quote, "It's extinct because of us. I think we've got a moral responsibility, if not a moral imperative, to see what we can do to bring it back," end quote. I have no idea what the difference is between a responsibility and an imperative, but it seems like an important distinction to him. So, of course, countless other frogs have gone extinct recently without attracting worldwide media attention or private donors to kickstart their resurrection. Around a decade ago, when Archer became captivated by the vanished gastric brooding frog, he christened the de-extinction effort the Lazarus Project, which of course got a lot of media attention. He presents de-extinction's urgent moral imperative in explicitly biblical terms. He writes, quote, "If we destroyed part of Eden, we are responsible for fixing up that garden." There's kind of a mashup of different biblical motifs here. Warming to his biblical theme, he insists that, quote, "This idea of restoring things that have become extinct has actually a biblical sanction." Archer cites 1 Corinthians 15:26 as establishing the injunction that, quote, "The last enemy that shall be destroyed is death." As far as I understand it, a common Christian exegesis of death as the last enemy assumes that death originated with Adam and Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden. Archer positions references to a primeval Edenic garden alongside Paul's commentary in Corinthians. Here, the we who destroyed Eden seems to align humanity as a whole, we who are damaging nature, with Adam and Eve. But it's worth noting that the imperative to overcome death, from which Archer derives a biblical sanction for de-extinction, is of course effected by God through Jesus. Numerous biblical passages, you know better than I'm sure, identify Jesus as the victor over death, the one who resurrects others and is himself resurrected. To note just one example, in John 11:25, Jesus proclaims himself, quote, "The resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live." Archer's recital of 1 Corinthians 15:26, by contrast, positions humans, or perhaps Archer himself, as possessing the divine power to vanquish death. On one reading, the story of Lazarus hints at a kind of resurrection as a public spectacle, redounding to the glory of God in Jesus. As the Bible says, quote, "It is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." The Lazarus story then might be read as indeed Archer seems to interpret it, as an ostentatious display of supernatural power. The story of a man, though of course not just any man, performing many signs, as scripture puts it, before the wondering crowds. In case the reference to Lazarus is too subtle for some audiences, Archer is explicit in press releases about the Frog De-Extinction Project. Quote, "We are watching Lazarus arise from the dead, step by exciting step." The media, of course, latches on to such claims with intemperate zeal. "Jesus wept," a British tabloid gushed in 2013. It goes on to say, like Lazarus, the long extinct gastric brooding frog could be brought back to life. Many news outlets, some even reputable, ran concurrent clickbait headlines claiming that the gastric brooding frog had been resurrected. In fact, however, Archer and his team, using surrogate eggs from distantly related species of frogs, had succeeded only in producing early-stage cloned embryos containing some of the extinct frog's DNA. The cells stopped dividing after a few days. No frog babies were vomited, and no significant advances in resurrecting the frog have occurred since, although people are still trying. So what should we make of Archer's appropriation of these biblical sources and the suggestion of himself as wielding godlike power? And this is really the question that interests me. Despite his fondness for citing Lazarus and death defiance, Archer dismisses charges of playing God, arguing that humans played God inappropriately when we drove species to extinction, and that de-extinction therefore rights a terrible wrong. This is an argument for justice, for undoing a harm. In another interview, Archer elaborates on these themes. "You know, just to be a tiny bit mischievous, because you should never trust professors quoting the Bible when we talk about, this is humans playing God. It actually bothers me a bit," he says, "that we need to remember what it says in 1 Corinthians 15:26, which seems to be the only Bible verse that he's never really memorized, that the last enemy that shall be destroyed is death. I mean," he says, "it's kind of like God's message to humans. Well, we messed up the Garden of Eden. Now it's our job to get rid of death because that is the enemy of life." And I don't see, this is an odd sentence, and I don't see that de-extinction couldn't be seen in this light. It's actually an effort to try to find a way to reverse the things that we've messed up. Reversing injustices, righting wrongs, concern for the least of these, all of these arguably are prominent biblical themes with ready-to-hand chapter and verse citations to back them up. But these are not the biblical sources or values that interest Archer. What interests him is the power and spectacle of resurrection, the glory and the fame. Yet, however spectacular resurrection might seem, Archer's alignment of de-extinction with divine victory over death actually makes little sense. If death is the enemy and God wills that we get rid of death, why stop or even start with de-extinction? Should we not strive to eradicate death altogether? Death generally, anywhere and everywhere, whatever its cause or consequences. References to Lazarus are puzzling too when combined with a motive of redressing wrongs to extinct creatures, i.e. it's extinct because of us. Jesus' resurrection, as far as I know, of Lazarus was not a reversal of any particular injustice. Lazarus' death, after all, was not caused by Jesus. So it seems that the prospect of death defiance is what attracts Archer over and above the undoing of past harms. Of course, Archer might just be being provocative, mischievous, as he likes to say. But no discernible trace of mischief is apparent in Archer's invocations elsewhere of the death-defying directives of Corinthians. In a variety of written and video sources, Archer recites these references to the Bible with what appears to be complete earnestness. So should we trust the Bible quoting professor or not? Interestingly, Archer's biography hints at a long-standing antipathy to religion. Born in Sydney, he actually grew up in Appalachia. That's as specific as I can get. It doesn't say exactly where, but Christian coal country, somewhere Kentucky, Tennessee, we're not entirely sure, West Virginia, where he picked up in Appalachia a fondness for banjo playing and moonshine, as he says, but not religion. Surrounded by believers in literal biblical creation, he cultivated what he calls a total obsession with science and fossils as a young boy. At age 14, Archer opted to forego a student exchange opportunity, bright student that he was, rather than declare any religion on a routine school form. And nowadays, he's the lead author on a widely cited decades-long study of the eroding, quote, religious gullibility of first-year biology students, as evidenced by movement away from creationist beliefs. He delights in debating creationists. Creation.com, an international organization with an Australian presence that proclaims the biblical truth, identifies Archer as an anti-creation ringleader. Creation.com notes that Archer objects to, quote, as they put it, biblical literalism of the creationists, and he cites anonymous theologians saying that it's bad theology, in his words, to engage in such literalism. So he doesn't like bad theology that quotes the Bible to make an argument. So it seems clear that Archer perceives religion, and particularly what he calls fundamentalist dogma, as a threat to science and secular progress, a danger, as he puts it, to a nation's intellectual health. He documents a more hopeful trend, the erosion of religious gullibility in the face of rational explanation. So all of this makes his turn to religion particularly puzzling, does it not? Perhaps he hopes that quoting scripture, albeit in a crude manner suggestive of bad theology, perhaps he thinks that that will make de-extinction converts of the 12 million or so Australians who identify as Christian. Or perhaps tired of accusations of playing God in Jurassic Park and all of that stuff, Archer cherry-picked a few biblical passages to beat back the naysayers. Above all, I believe that Archer holds a view of religion and science as competing superpowers. Events in his life and career suggest that he understands science and secular forces to usher in the decline of religion. His strategic use of the Bible pits religion and science against one another in a territorial dispute over public authority. Excitement about de-extinction, then, is excitement at the prospect of science and technology achieving miraculous results of the sort hinted at in Scripture. Mining scriptural texts, Archer props up extravagant claims for the miracle powers of science. The appeal of de-extinction may be that it is the closest science can get to commanding sacred powers. In appropriating life and death powers for themselves, proponents of de-extinction reinvent the human relationship to death. Species death, and indeed death in general, is presented as something to be overcome through technological heroism. Even as proponents often appeal to de-extinction's role in restoring justice, these technologies fail to address the root causes of extinction, i.e. us, habitat loss, and a number of things that humans are doing. Instead, death of any sort is simply recast as a remediable defect in the system. In this respect, de-extinctionists often fail to grasp what is unique and uniquely tragic about human-caused extinction. Spectacle, then. Spectacles are deceptive things, right? They're a trick of sorts. And the root words, which I don't have time to go into here, but if you look at the root words of spectacle, they're linked to things like species, the same word, specious, spectacle, all having to do with looking, with watching, with showing, but also with showiness, with showing off, with making a show of something, with a kind of deception, to show something in a way that is a performance, when things are not what they seem. So appeals to the awesome power of the technology of de-extinction, propped up with scriptural quotes, distracts us from serious gaps in the logic of de-extinction. It's as if these gaps can simply be filled in, like so many missing pieces of DNA or biblical text. Once the selective cutting and pasting of textual bits is complete, Archer hopes the audience will be too wowed by the results to evaluate the flimsy rationales. And yet, in his appropriation of biblical texts, Archer makes a category mistake. Or perhaps he hopes that we, his audience, will not detect the sleight of hand. De-extinction is not resurrection, but something like creation, something built or crafted anew, something crafty, something done craftily. Should it succeed, the resulting creatures would be highly engineered end products of genetic cutting and pasting, lacking the evolutionary richness of their vanished kin. They would be displayed like modern-day curios, an oddity, a monument to human achievement, and a spectacle to be gawped at. And yet not so modern after all. While de-extinction techniques appear audaciously cutting edge, their proponents seem strangely beholden to an old-fashioned concept of species, a concept rooted in outward appearance, showiness, rather than DNA analysis, for example, or genetic fidelity. For de-extinctionists, as one scholar notes, if it looks like a duck and acts like a duck, it's a good enough duck, or thylacine, or gastric brooding frog, or whatever. At the moment, in fact, a revitalized effort to de-extinct the thylacine is underway at the University of Melbourne. Researchers there are seeking a suitable living relative onto whose genome they can graft particular genes from the thylacine specimen. The resulting animal, the lead scientist, who's Andrew Pask, the resulting animal, he explains, could have enough of the original thylacine to look and act very similar to the extinct creature. Describing the hoped-for return of the de-extincted woolly mammoth, George Church concurs. Our goal, he says, is to make a cold-resistant elephant, but it's going to look and behave like a mammoth. Not because we're trying to trick anybody, he hastens to add. Of course not. To look and act, but not to be, not really, but enough, perhaps, to deceive the wondering crowds. Thank you. And thanks to Jackie and I think Matt, whoever's there behind the scenes, for organizing this and helping with the tech. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. We have a few questions already. So the first one is from Matt. How complete are the genomes we have of extinct animals? And is there a rush to fully genome species on the brink of extinction? How much genetic diversity do we lose?
So I think part of the confusion, that's a great question. Part of the confusion, I think, is that when scientists talk about, like they will say they have a complete genome of certain species that they're very interested in. But I think that the language of completion here means something different than what the average person would think that it means, because with extinct species, there still has to be this kind of filling in from DNA material from a close relative. So I think what they mean is that they have enough of it that they think they can figure out what's missing, and then they can incorporate the rest of that from a close relative, if there is one. There's actually a big rush to complete these genomes. And what's interesting, though, and I think a little bit disturbing, is if you look at, in some ways, it's similar to conservation efforts where, you know, the organisms that humans tend to be most interested in, they skew towards our own particular biases, like the things that we find to be charismatic or beautiful or exciting. I mean, there's reasons that certain creatures are chosen. As I said, like the gastric brooding frog, there are lots and lots of frogs that go extinct every minute. I mean, amphibian extinction is widespread, probably due to some sort of global fungus that humans have disseminated. But, you know, why choose this one? Well, I mean, clearly because it has medical benefits, also because it's cool, which is language that scientists often actually use, some of them, that it's cool. This is a kind of colloquial word for wonder, I think. But, you know, there's a fixation on particular organisms. So we just we'll try to say very quickly about the cold tolerant elephant. I mean, the thing with that is that you know, or the passenger pigeon. You know, some people argue that's because they're keystone sort of species. You bring these species back and you've got a whole ecosystem that can be restored. And yet it doesn't really matter to George Church or the people de-extinction who want to de-extinct this organism. It doesn't really matter that, as you see, that it's actually like a mammoth. It just matters that it sort of can look like one or act like one. And so the idea that you're actually resurrecting something, you're bringing back the thing that was lost, is very, very misleading. And I could go on and on about that, but I'll just stop there.
Thanks. We have another question from Mosh. Modernists like Archer offer cheap atonement for our ecological sins. What might a Christian view of resurrection hope contribute to de-extinction research?
I'm not sure I can answer that question because I don't think about it from the standpoint of what a Christian resurrection would look like. But I would say that I think there, part of what we see in these efforts is a denial of death and of grief and of culpability, so I think that if you want to conserve species or prevent extinction, then you don't focus on the excitement of bringing the thing back. What you focus on is the causes, and you can think about if you want to use that language of injustice, of righting wrongs, of suffering, our suffering kin. There's all kinds of, seems to me, religious elements, specifically Christian, but not only Christian, that address those kinds of values, right? If that's what it's about, then start there. Start with a kind of restoration that takes into account our responsibility and the suffering of those organisms. And when that's not possible, I think sometimes the religious response and perhaps the Christian response is to accept death and to grieve it, because otherwise it doesn't mean anything.
Great, thanks, Lisa. One question from Doe. The obsession of de-extinction seems to be the scientistic correspondent of the creationist obsession with origins. Shouldn't we focus on saving this world?
Sure, there are lots of people doing that already. I mean, I think that de-extinction and a lot of these kinds of technologies are not only, they're taking resources away from what I mean by saving the world, which is saving what's left and trying to protect, the organisms that are here. It's also, I think, ethicists sometimes refer to what they call the moral hazard argument, right? Where, this often comes up in the context of climate change, that if we think that we can simply repair the climate through geoengineering, then why should we stop emitting greenhouse gases? Why stop doing anything that we're doing, right? And de-extinction is a trap in that way, potentially, and that the more successful it looks to the public, even though actually it's not very successful, and the media is complicit in this, but the more successful it looks, the less people actually are concerned about saving the world, if you mean by saving the world, keeping alive, the things that are here that are suffering and dying, rather than trying to bring back something that's not the thing that was lost anyway. And it's just going to take a lot of time and resources and money and create a false narrative about what's actually going on.
Okay, I think that's all the time that we have for questions. Yeah, okay, we'll have to end there. Thanks so much, Lisa.
Thank you. And if I see some other questions in the chat, if anyone wants to reach out to me personally, please.
Yeah, I believe Graham McLean put a question in the chat, and we've also got the link in the chat leads to all the other questions, and you can have a look at those as well. But there have been some really great questions. Can we thank Lisa for her talk?